Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story. Okay, here we go. Are you ready? Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. The shout out is for our friend. Let's see what the spinning wheel says today. Ashu. And I'm probably mispronouncing. Okay. So it says here, my name is Asheria, and I'm probably butchering that. So again, I apologize. I'm terrible with names. I should have Joe do this, I swear. My channel is Paper Crafts, and contains several playlists by topic. Pongal crafts, Valentine's Day crafts, New Year's crafts, school supplies, DUI, Elsa crafts, BTS, and Blackpink crafts. So a whole bunch of crafts with lots of paper, parents, art students, and of course children. Great for origami, which I did once upon a time. I thought it was very cool and kind of relaxing. So if you're into art, crafts, or just want to watch some relaxing videos, check her out. Like, share, comment to let her know we sent you by. Have a good day. Alright, Mr. Bud, what you going to tell us?
Well, for those of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s, and education was a little more simplified, unless you did something of, remarkable achievement, you might have gotten a sentence or two in the history books. Now, some people, though, like presidents and stuff, usually got a pretty good page or two, depending on what and all they did. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. Well, Susan B. Anthony, for Women's History Month, took and basically wrote her own chapter on things. Social reformer, women's rights activist, played a pivotal role in the women's suffrage movement, and she's born into a Quaker family and was big on social equality. Starting even at the young age of 17, she was collecting anti-slavery petitions, and in 1856 became the New York State agent for the American Anti-Slavery Society. This was before the Civil War kicked off. Now, Susan B. Anthony was born in 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts. She lived to a right old age of 86 years old, still in New York, up in that area around Rochester. But, she started off in 1851, met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who became her lifelong friend and co-worker in the social reform activities, primarily in the fields of women's rights. Together they founded the New York Women's State Temperance Society after Anthony was prevented from speaking at a temperance conference because she was female. During the Civil War, they founded the Women's Loyal National League, which conducted the largest petition drive in the United States history at that time, collecting nearly 400,000 signatures in support of the abolition of slavery. After the war, they initiated the American Equal Rights Association, which campaigned for equal rights for both women and African Americans. They published a women's rights newspaper in 1868 called The Revolution. A year later, they founded the National Women Suffrage Association as part of the split with the women's movement. The split was formally healed in 1890 when the organization merged with the rival American Women's Suffrage Association to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, with Anthony as its key force. Anthony and Stanton began working with Matilda Joslyn Gage in 1876 on what eventually grew into the six-volume History of Women's Suffrage. The interests of Anthony and Stanton diverged somewhat in later years, but the two remained close friends. In 1872, Anthony was actually arrested in her hometown of Rochester for voting in violation of laws that only allowed men to vote. She was convicted in a widely publicized trial. Although she refused to pay the fine, the authorities declined to take further action. In 1878, Anthony and Stanton arranged for Congress to be presented with an amendment giving women the right to vote. It was introduced by a Senator Aaron A. Sargent, a Republican out of California, and it was later known colloquially as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Eventually, it would become ratified as the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1920.
Woo!
Now, Anthony traveled extensively in support of women's suffrage, giving as many as 75 to 100 speeches a year.
Oh, that's impressive.
Yeah, working on many state campaigns. She worked internationally for women's rights, playing a key role in the creating of the International Council of Women, which is still active. She also helped bring about the Women's Congress of Representative Women at the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. When she first began campaigning for women's rights, she was harshly ridiculed and accused of trying to destroy the institution of marriage. Public perception of her radically changed during her lifetime, though. On her 80th birthday, she was celebrated in the White House at the invitation of President William McKinley. She also became the first female citizen to be depicted on a U.S. coin when her portrait appeared on the 1979 dollar coin. I think I've still got a couple of those myself. Now, we'll hit the rewind just a touch. Some details of her early life. She was born February 15th, 1820, to Daniel Anthony and Lucy Reed Anthony in Adams, Massachusetts, second oldest of 7 children. She was named for her maternal grandmother, Susanna, and for her father's sister, Susan. In her youth, she and her sisters responded to a great craze for middle initials by adopting middle initials to their own names. Anthony adopted B as her middle initial became her namesake. Aunt Susan had married a man named Brownell. Anthony never used the name Brownell herself, and she did not like it. Her family shared a passion for social reform. Her brothers Daniel and Merritt moved to Kansas to join the anti-slavery movement there. Merritt fought with John Brown against pro-slavery forces during a bleeding Kansas crisis. Daniel eventually owned a newspaper and became the mayor of Leavenworth. Anthony's sister Mary, with whom she shared a home in later years, became a public school principal in Rochester and another women's rights activist. Anthony's father was an abolitionist and a temperance advocate, a Quaker. He had a difficult relationship with his traditionalist congregation, which rebuked him for marrying a non-Quaker, then disowned him for allowing a dance school to operate in his home. He continued to attend Quaker meetings anyway and became even more radical in his beliefs. Anthony's mother was a Baptist and helped raise the children in a more tolerant version of her husband's religious tradition. Their father encouraged them all, girls as well as boys, to be self-supporting, teaching them business principles and giving them responsibilities at an early age. When Anthony was only 6 years old, her family moved to Battenville, New York, where her father managed a large cotton mill. Previously, he had operated his own small cotton factory. And when she was 17, Anthony was sent to a Quaker boarding school in Philadelphia, where she unhappily endured its strict and sometimes humiliating atmosphere. She was forced to end her studies after one term because the family was financially ruined during the economic downturn known as the Panic of 1837. They were forced to sell everything they had at an auction, but they were rescued by their maternal uncle, who bought most of their belongings and restored them to the family. To assist her family financially, Anthony left home to teach at a Quaker boarding school. Well, by 1845, the family moved to a farm on the outskirts of Rochester, New York, purchased partially with the inheritance from Anthony's mother. There, they associated with a group of Quaker social reformers who had left their congregation because of the restrictions it placed on reform activities, and in 1848 formed a new organization called the Congregational Friends. The Anthony farmstead soon became the Sunday afternoon gathering place for local activities, including Frederick Douglass, a former slave and prominent abolitionist who became Anthony's lifelong friend. Now, the Anthony family began to attend services at the First Unitarian Church of Rochester, which was associated with social reform. The Rochester Women's Rights Convention of 1848 was held at that church the same year, inspired by the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention, which was held 2 weeks earlier in a nearby town. Anthony's parents and her sister Mary attended the Rochester Convention and signed the Declaration of Sentiments, which had been first adopted by the Seneca Falls Convention. Anthony did not take part in either of these conventions because she had moved to Kanahori in 1846 to be the headmistress of the female department of the academy. Away from Quaker influences for the first time in her life at the age of 26, she began to replace her plain clothing with more stylish dresses, and she quit using "thee" and other forms of speech traditionally used by the Quakers. She was interested in social reform, and she had distressed at being paid much less than men with similar jobs, but she was moved by her father's enthusiasm over the Rochester Women's Rights Convention. She later explained, "I wasn't ready to vote, I didn't want to vote, but I did want equal pay for equal work." Well, when the academy closed the following year, Anthony took over operation of the family farm in Rochester so her father could devote more time to his insurance business. She worked at this task for a couple of years, but found herself increasingly drawn to reform activity. With her parents' support, she was soon fully engaged in reform work. For the rest of her life, she lived almost entirely on fees she earned as a speaker. Well, a little quote says, "Cautious, careful people, always casting about to preserve their reputation and social standing, never can bring about a reform. Those who are really in earnest must be willing to be anything or nothing in this world's estimation, and publicly and privately, in season and out, avow their sympathy with despised and persecuted ideas and their activists, and bear the consequences." This was a quote from Susan B. Anthony herself in 1860. Well, she began her career in social reform with energy and determination, schooling herself in reform issues. She found herself drawn more to the radical ideas of people like William Lloyd Garrison, George Thompson, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Soon she was wearing the controversial bloomer dress, consisting of pantaloons worn under a knee-length dress. Although she felt more sensible than the traditional heavy dresses that dragged the ground, she reluctantly quit wearing it after a year because it gave her opponents the opportunity to focus on her apparel rather than her ideas. In 1851, she was introduced to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had been one of the organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention and had introduced the controversial resolution in support of women's suffrage. Anthony and Stanton were introduced to Amelia Bloomer, a feminist and mutual acquaintance. Anthony and Stanton soon became close friends and co-workers, forming a relationship that was pivotal for them and for the women's movement in the whole. After the Stantons had moved from Seneca Falls to New York City in 1861, a room was set aside for Anthony in every house they lived in. One of the Stanton's biographers estimated that over her lifetime, Stanton probably spent more time with Anthony with any other adult, including her own husband. Now, two women had complementary skills. Anthony excelled at organizing, while Stanton had the aptitude for intellectual matters and writing. Anthony was dissatisfied with her own writing abilities and wrote relatively little for publication. While historians illustrate her thoughts in direct quotes, they usually take them from her speeches, letters, and diary entries. Now, because Stanton was homebound with 7 children while Anthony was unmarried and free to travel, Anthony assisted Stanton by supervising her children while Stanton wrote. One of Anthony's biographers said, "Susan became one of the family and was almost another mother to Mrs. Stanton's children."
Interesting.
A biography of Stanton says that during the early years of their relationship, Stanton provided the ideas, rhetoric, and strategy, and Anthony delivered the speeches, circulated petitions, and rented the halls. Anthony prodded, and Stanton produced. Stanton's husband said, "Susan stirred the puddings, Elizabeth stirred up the Susan, and then Susan stirs up the world."
Oh, that is
Awkward. Stanton herself said, "I forged the thunderbolts, and she fired them." By 1854, Anthony and Stanton had perfected the collaboration that made New York State movement the most sophisticated in the country, according to Ann D. Gordon, a professor of women's history. Now, temperance was very much a women's rights issue at that time because the laws that gave husbands complete control of the family and its finances. A woman with a drunken husband had little legal recourse, even if his alcoholism left the family destitute. and he was abusive to her and their children. If she obtained a divorce, which was difficult to do, he could end up with the sole guardianship of the children. Charming.
That's reassuring.
While teaching in the academy, Anthony joined the Daughters of Temperance and in 1849 gave her first public speech at one of the meetings. In 1852, she was elected as a delegate to the State Temperance Convention, but the chairman stopped her when she tried to speak, saying that women delegates were only there to listen and learn. Anthony and some other women immediately walked out and announced a meeting of their own, which created a committee to organize a women's states convention. Largely organized by Anthony, the convention of 500 women met in Rochester in April and created the Women's State Temperance Society, with Stanton as president, Anthony as a state agent. Now, Anthony and her co-workers collected 28,000 signatures on a petition for a law to prohibit the sale of alcohol in New York State. Pretty impressive. She organized a hearing on that law before the New York legislature, the first that had been initiated in that state by a group of women. At the organization's convention the following year, however, conservative members attacked Stanton's advocacy of the right of a wife of an alcoholic to obtain a divorce. Stanton was voted out as president, whereupon she and Anthony resigned from the organization. In 1853, Anthony attended the World's Temperance Convention in New York City, which was bogged down for 3 chaotic days while a dispute about whether women would be allowed to speak there. It's the Women's Temperance Union. Why not let them speak?
Are they going to do sit in silence?
No kidding. Years later, Anthony observed, no advanced step taken by women had been so bitterly contested as that of speaking in public. For nothing which they had attempted, not even to secure the suffrage, had they been so abused, condemned, and antagonized. After this period, Anthony focused her energy on abolitionist and women's rights activities. While Anthony tried to speak at the New York State Teachers Association meeting in 1853, her attempt to speak sparked a half-hour debate among the men about whether it was proper for women to speak in public. Finally allowed to continue, Anthony said, "Do you not see that so long as society says a woman is incompetent to be a lawyer, a minister, or a doctor, but has the ample ability to be a teacher, that every man of you who chooses this profession tactically acknowledges he has no more brains than a woman?" In 1857, the Teachers Convention, she introduced a resolution calling for the admission of black people to public schools and colleges, but it was rejected as not a proper subject for discussion. When she introduced another resolution calling for males and females to be educated together at all levels, including colleges, it was fiercely opposed and decisively rejected. One opponent called the idea a vast social evil, the first step in the school which seeks to abolish marriage, and behind this picture I see a monster of social deformity. Charming. Anthony continued to speak at state teachers' conventions for several years, insisting that women teachers should receive equal pay with men and serve as officers and committee members within the organization. Now, Anthony's work for the women's rights movement began at a time when the movement was already gathering momentum. Stanton had helped organize the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, a local event which was the first women's rights convention, and 2 years later, the first in a series of national women's rights conventions was held in Worcester, Massachusetts. 2 years later after that, Anthony attended her first national women's rights convention, which was held in Syracuse, New York, where she served as one of the convention's secretaries. According to Ida Husted Harper, Anthony's authorized biographer, Ms. Anthony came away from the Syracuse Convention thoroughly convinced that it was the right of which women needed above every other, the one indeed which would secure to her all others, was the right of suffrage. Suffrage, however, did not become the main focus of her work for several more years. A major hindrance to the women's movement was a lack of money. Well, few women at the time had an independent source of income, and even those with employment generally were required by law to turn over their pay to their husbands. Partly through the efforts of the women's movement, a law had been passed in New York in 1848 that recognized some of the rights for married women, but that law was limited. In 1853, Anthony worked with William Henry Channing, her activist Unitarian minister, to organize a convention in Rochester to launch a state campaign towards improved property rights for married women, which Anthony would lead. She would lecture and petition in a campaign to almost every county in New York during the winter of 1855, despite the difficulty of traveling in snowy weather and horse and buggy days. Yay!
Yay.
When she presented the petitions to the New York State Senate Judiciary Committee, its members told her that men were actually the oppressed sex because they did such things as giving women the best seats in carriages.
Sure, that's how that works.
Noting cases in which the petition had been signed by both husbands and wives instead of the husband signing for both, which was the standard procedure, the committee's official report sarcastically recommended that the petitioner seek a law authorizing the husband in such marriages to wear petticoats and wives' trousers.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah, the campaign finally achieved success in 1860 when the legislature passed and improved Married Women's Property Acts, which gave married women the right to own separate property, enter contracts and be the joint guardian of their children. The legislature rolled back much of this law.
Heaven forbid that they should have custody of their children in a home where they both live.
Yeah. Says the legislature rolled back much of this law in 1862. However, during the period when the women's movement was largely inactive because of the American Civil War. Now, the women's movement was loosely structured at the time with a few state organizations and no national organization other than a coordinating committee that arranged annual conventions. Lucy Stone, who did much of this organizational work for the national conventions, encouraged Anthony to take over some of the responsibility for them. Anthony resisted at first, feeling that she was needed more in the field of anti-slavery activities. After organizing a series of anti-slavery meetings in the winter of 1857, Anthony told a friend that the experience of last winter is worth more to me than all my temperance and women's rights work, though the latter were the school necessary to bring me into the anti-slavery work. During a planning session for the 1858 Women's Rights Convention, Stone, who had recently given birth, told Anthony that her new family responsibilities would prevent her from organizing conventions until the children are older. Anthony presided at the 1858 convention, and when planning committee for national conventions was reorganized, Stanton became the president, Anthony its secretary. Anthony continued to be heavily involved in the anti-slavery work at the same time. Well, in 1837, at the age of 16, Anthony started collecting petitions against slavery as part of a organized resistance to the newly established gag rule that prohibited anti-slavery petitions in the United States House of Representatives. In 1851, she played a key role in organizing an anti-slavery convention in Rochester, and she was part of the Underground Railroad. An entry in her diary in 1861 read, "Fitted out a fugitive slave for Canada with the help of Harriet Tubman." Woo! There you go. And in 1856, she agreed to become a New York State agent for the American Slavery Society, Anti-Slavery Society, with the understanding that she would also continue her advocacy in women's rights. Anthony organized anti-slavery meetings throughout the state under banners that read, "No compromise with slaveholders, immediate and unconditional emancipation." Now, in 1859, John Brown was executed for leading a violent raid on the U.S. arsenal at Harper's Ferry in what was intended to begin the beginning of an armed slave uprising. Anthony organized and presided over a meeting of mourning and indignation at Rochester's Corinthian Hall on the day of the execution to raise money for Brown's family. She developed a reputation for fearlessness in facing down attempts to disrupt her meetings, but opposition became overwhelming on the eve of the Civil War. Mob action shut down her meetings in every town from Buffalo to Albany in early 1861. In Rochester, the police had to escort Anthony and other speakers from the building for their own safety. Syracuse, according to a local newspaper, rotten eggs were thrown, benches broken, and knives and pistols gleamed in every direction. Anthony expressed a vision of a racially integrated society that was radical for a time when abolitionists were debating the question on what was to become of the slaves after they were freed, and when people like Abraham Lincoln were calling for African Americans to be shipped to a newly established colony in Africa. In a speech in 1861, Anthony said, Let us open to the colored man all our schools. Let us admit him into our mechanic shops, stores, offices, and lucrative benches and vocations. Let him rent such a pew in the church and occupy such seat in the theater. Extend to him all all the rights of citizenship. The relatively small women's rights movement at that time was closely associated with the American Anti-Slavery Society, led by William Lloyd Garrison. The women's movement depended heavily on abolitionist resources, with its articles published in their newspapers and some of the funding provided by abolitionists. There was tension, however, between leaders of the women's movement and the male abolitionists who, although supporters of increased women's rights, believed that a vigorous campaign for women's rights would interfere with the campaign against slavery. In 1860, when Anthony sheltered a woman who had fled an abusive husband, Garrison insisted the woman give up the child she had brought with her, pointing out the law gave husbands complete control of the children. Anthony reminded Garrison that he helped slaves escape to Canada in violation of the law and said, "Well, the law which gives the father ownership of the child is just as wicked, and I'll break it just as quickly." When Stanton introduced a resolution at the National Women's Rights Convention in 1860 favoring more lenient divorce laws, leading abolitionist Wendell Phillips not only opposed it but attempted to have it removed from the record. When Stanton, Anthony, and others supported a bill before the New York legislature which would permit divorce in cases of desertion or inhuman treatment, Horace Greeley, an abolitionist newspaper publisher, campaigned against it in the pages of his own newspaper. Garrison, Phillips, and Greeley all had provided valuable help to the women's movement. In a letter to Lucy Stone, Anthony said, "The men, even the best of them, seem to think that the women's rights question should be waived for the present. So let us do our own work, and we'll do it our own way." Well, Anthony and Stanton organized the Women's Loyal National League in 1863 to campaign for an amendment for the U.S. Constitution that would abolish slavery. It was the first national women's political organization in the United States. In the largest petition drive in the United States history, as mentioned, the League collected nearly 400,000 signatures to abolish slavery, representing approximately 1 out of every 24 adults in the northern states. The petition drive significantly assisted the passage of the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery. Anthony was the chief organizer of this effort, which involving recruiting and coordinating some 2,000 petition collectors. The League provided the women's movement with a vehicle for combining the fight against slavery with the fight for women's rights by reminding the public that petitioning was the only political tool available to women at a time when only men were allowed to vote. With a membership of 5,000, it helped develop a new generation of women leaders, providing experience and recognition not only for Stanton and Anthony, but for newcomers like Anna Dickinson, a gifted teenage orator. The League demonstrated the value of a formal structure to a women's movement that had resisted being anything other than loosely organized up to that point. The widespread network of women activists who assisted the League expanded the pool of talent that was available to reform movements, including the women's suffrage movement after the war. Well, Anthony stayed with her brother Daniel in Kansas for 8 months in 1865 to assist with his newspaper. Then she headed back east after she learned that an amendment to the U.S. Constitution had been proposed that would provide citizenship for African Americans, but would also make, for the first time, introduce the word male into the Constitution. Anthony supported citizenship for blacks, but opposed any attempt to link it with a reduction in the status of women. Her ally Stanton agreed, saying if that word male be inserted, it would most certainly take a century at least to get it out. Anthony and Stanton worked to revive the women's rights movement, which had been nearly dormant during the Civil War, and by 1866 they organized the 11th National Women's Rights Convention, the first since the Civil War began. Unanimously, they adopted a resolution introduced by Anthony. The convention voted to transform itself into the American Equal Rights Association, whose purpose was to campaign for the equal rights of all citizens, especially the right of suffrage. The leadership of the new organization included such prominent activists as Lucretia Mott, Lucy Stone, and Frederick Douglass. As the AREA's drive for universal suffrage was resisted by some abolitionist leaders and their allies in the Republican Party, during the period before 1867 convention to revise the New York State Constitution, Horace Greeley, prominent editor, told Anthony and Stanton that the critical period for the Republican Party and the life of our nation, I conjure you to remember that this is the Negro's hour, and your first duty now is to go through the state and plead his claims. Abolitionist leaders Wendell Phillips and Theodore Tilton, met with Anthony and Stanton at the office of the National Anti-Slavery Standard, a leading abolitionist newspaper. The two men tried to convince the two women that their time had not yet come for women's suffrage, that they should campaign not for voting rights for both women and African Americans in the revised state constitution, but for voting rights for the black men only. According to Ida Husted Harper...
Yes, let's do one at a time.
No kidding. Duh. According to Ida Husted Harper, Anthony's authorized biographer, Anthony was highly indignant and declared that she had soon better cut off her own right hand than ask for the ballot for the black man and not for the woman. Anthony and Stanton continued to work for the inclusion of the suffrage for both African Americans and women. In 1867, the AREA campaigned in Kansas for referendums that would enfranchise both African Americans and women. Wendell Phillips, who opposed mixing the two causes, blocked the funding to the AREA had expected for their campaign. After the internal struggle, Kansas Republicans decided to support suffrage for black men only and formed an anti-female suffrage committee. How bored are you guys? Duh. By the end of the summer, the ARA campaign had almost collapsed as its finances were exhausted. Anthony and Stanton created a storm of controversy by accepting help from the last days of the campaign from George Francis Train, a wealthy businessman who supported women's rights. Train antagonized many activists by attacking the Republican Party and openly disparaging their integrity and intelligence of African Americans. There is hope to believe, however, that Anthony and Stanton had hoped to draw the volatile Train away from cruder forms of racism, and that he had actually begun to do so. After the Kansas campaign, the ARA increasingly divided into two wings, both advocating universal suffrage but with different approaches. One wing, whose leading feature was Lucy Stone, was willing for black men to achieve suffrage first and wanted to maintain close ties with the Republican Party and the abolitionist movement. The other, whose leading figures were Anthony and Stanton, insisted that women and black men should be enfranchised at the same time and working towards a politically independent women's movement that would no longer be dependent on abolitionists. The ARA effectively dissolved after an acrimonious meeting in May of 1869, and the two competing women's suffrage organizations were created in its aftermath. Now, Anthony and Stanton began publishing a weekly newspaper called The Revolution in New York City in 1868. It focused primarily on women's rights, especially suffrage for women, but it also covered other topics, including politics, the labor movement, and finance. Its motto was, "Men, their rights, and nothing more. Women's, their rights, and nothing less." One of its goals was to provide a forum for which women could exchange opinions on key issues from a variety of viewpoints. Anthony managed the business aspect of the paper, while Stanton was co-editor along with Parker Pillsbury, an abolitionist and supporter of women's rights. Initial funding was provided by George Francis Train, the controversial businessman who supported women's rights, but alienated many activists with his political and racial views. In the aftermath of the Civil War, major periodicals associated with radical social reform movements had either become more conservative or had quit publishing or soon would. Anthony intended for the Revolution to partially fill this void, hoping to grow it eventually into a daily paper with its own printing press, all owned and operated by women. The funding Train had arranged for the newspaper, however, was less than Anthony had expected. Moreover, Train sailed for England after the Revolution published its first issue, and would soon be jailed for supporting Irish independence.
Well then, how dare the Irish?
No kidding. Train's financial support would eventually disappear entirely, and after 29 months, mounting debts forced Anthony to transfer the paper to Laura Curtis Bullard, a wealthy women's rights activist who gave it a less radical tone. The paper published its last issues less than 2 years later. Despite its short life, the Revolution gave Anthony and Stanton a means for expressing their views during the developing split within the women's movement. It also helped them promote the wing of the movement, which eventually led to a separate organization. Now, the National Labor Union, which had formed in 1866, began reaching out to farmers, African Americans, and women with the intention of forming a broad-based political party. The Revolution responded enthusiastically, declaring the principles of the National Labor Union are our principles. It predicted that the producers, the working men, the women, the Negroes, are destined to form a triple power which shall speedily wrest the scepter of government from the non-producers, the land
we succeeded at
monopolizers.
that.
Oh, terribly. The bondholders, the politicians. Anthony and Stanton were seated as delegates in the Working Women's Association, which had recently been formed in the offices of the Revolution. The attempted alliance did not last long. During a printer's strike in 1869, Anthony voiced approval of an employer-sponsored training program which would teach women skills that would enable them to replace the strikers. Anthony viewed the program as an opportunity to increase employment of women in a trade from which women were often excluded from employers and unions. At the next NLU Congress, Anthony was first seated as a delegate, but then unseated because of strong opposition from those who accused her of supporting strikebreakers.
Because she suggested replacing them. That makes sense.
Oh, yeah. Anthony worked with the WWA to form an all-female labor union, but with little success. She accomplished more in her work with the joint campaign with the WWA and the Revolution to win a pardon for Hester Vaughan, a domestic worker who had been found guilty of infanticide and sentenced to death. Charging that the social and legal systems treated women unfairly, the WWA petitioned, organized a mass meeting in which Anthony was one of the speakers, sent delegations to visit Vaughan in prison, and speak with the governor. Vaughan was eventually pardoned. Originally with a membership that included over 100 wage-earning women, the WWA evolved into an organization consisting almost entirely of journalists, doctors, and other middle-class working women. Its members formed the core of the New York City portion of the new nationalist suffrage organization, National Suffragist Organization, that Anthony and Stanton were in the process of forming. Now, by May 1869, 2 days after the final AREA convention, Anthony, Stanton, and several others formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, and in November of the same year, Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, and others formed a competing American Women's Suffrage Association. The hostile nature of their rivalry created a partisan atmosphere that endured for decades, affecting even professional historians of the women's movement. The immediate cause of the split was the proposed 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which would prohibit the denial of suffrage because of race. In one of the most controversial actions, Anthony campaigned against the amendment. She and Stanton called for women and African Americans to be enfranchised at the same time. They said that by effectively enfranchising all men while excluding all women, the amendment would create an aristocracy of sex by giving constitutional authority to the idea that men were superior to women. In 1873, Anthony said, an oligarchy of wealth, where the rich govern the poor, an oligarchy of learning, where the educated govern the ignorant, or even the oligarchy of race, where the Saxons rule the African, might be endured, but surely the oligarchy of sex, which makes men of every household sovereigns, masters, the women subjects, slaves, carrying dissension and rebellion into every home of the nation, cannot be endured. The AWSA supported the amendment, but Lucy Stone, which became the most prominent leader, also made it clear she believed that suffrage for women would be more beneficial to the country than the suffrage for black men. The two organizations had other differences as well. The NWSA was politically independent, but the AWSA was at least initially aimed for close ties with the Republican Party, hoping that the ratification of the 15th Amendment would lead to a Republican push for women's suffrage. The NWSA focused primarily on winning suffrage at the national level, while the AWSA pursued a state-by-state strategy. The NWSA initially worked on a wider range of women's issues than the AWSA, including divorce reform and equal pay for women. Now, events soon removed much of the basis for the split in the women's movement. In 1870, a debate over the 15th Amendment was made irrelevant when the amendment was officially ratified. In 1872, disgust with corruption in government led to a mass defection of abolitionists and other social reformers from the Republicans in the short-lived Liberal Republican Party. As early as 1875, Anthony began urging the NWSA to focus more exclusively on women's suffrage than a variety of women's issues. The rivalry between the two groups was so bitter, however, that a merger proved to be impossible for 20 years.
Wow.
The AWSA, which was especially stronger in New England, was the larger of the two organizations, but began to decline in strength during the 1880s. In 1890, the two organizations emerged as the National American Women's Suffrage Association, with Stanton as president, but with Anthony as its effective leader. When Stanton retired from her post in 1892, Anthony became the president. Now, the national suffrage movement says by the end of the Civil War, according to historian Ann D. Gordon, Susan B. Anthony occupied new social and political territory. She was emerging on the national scene as a female leader, something new in American history, and she did so as a single woman in a culture perceives the spinster as anomalous and unguarded. By the 1880s, she was among the one of the senior political figures in the United States. After the formation of the NWSA, Anthony dedicated herself fully to the organization of women's suffrage. She did not draw a salary from either it or its successor, but on the contrary, used her lecture fees to fund those organizations. There was no national office, the mailing address simply being that of one of the officers. That Anthony had remained unmarried gave her an important business advantage in her work. A married woman at that time had legal things of femme covert, which, among other things, excluded her from signing contracts. Her husband could do that for her if he chose. As Anthony had no husband, she was a femme soleil and could freely sign her contracts for convention halls, printing materials, etc. Using fees she earned by lecturing, she paid off the debts she had accumulated while supporting the revolution. While press treating her as a celebrity, she proved to be a major draw. Over her speeches, again averaging 75 to 100 speeches per year, travel conditions of the early days were sometimes appalling. Once she gave a speech from the top of a billiard table. Ooh. On another occasion, her train was snowbound for days, and she survived on crackers and dried fish. Both Anthony and Stanton joined the lecture circuit about 1870, usually traveling from mid-autumn to spring. The timing was right because the nation was beginning to discuss women's suffrage as a serious matter. Occasionally they traveled together, but most often not. Lecture bureaus scheduled their tours and handled the travel arrangements, which generally involved traveling during the day and speaking at night, sometimes for weeks at a time, including weekends. These lectures brought about new recruits into the movement and strengthened suffrage organizations at the state, local, and national levels. Their journeys during the decade covered a distance that was unprecedented by any other reformer or politician. Anthony's other suffrage work included organizing national conventions, lobbying Congress and state legislatures, and participating in a seamless endless series of state suffrage campaigns. Now, a special opportunity arose in 1876 when the U.S. celebrated its 100th birthday as an independent country. The NWSA asked permission to present an official Declaration of Rights for Women at the official ceremony in Philadelphia, but was refused. Undaunted, 5 women, headed by Anthony, walked onto the platform during the ceremony and handed their declaration to a startled official in charge. As they left, they handed out copies of it to the crowd. Spotting an unoccupied bandstand outside the hall, Anthony mounted it and read the declaration to a large crowd. Afterwards, she invited everyone to the NWSA convention at a nearby Unitarian church, where speakers like Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton awaited them. Now, the work of all the segments of the women's suffrage movement began to show clear results. Women won the right to vote in Wyoming in 1869 and in Utah in 1870. Now, her lectures in Washington and 4 other states led directly to invitations for her to address the state legislatures there. The Grange, a large advocacy group for farmers, officially supported women's suffrage as early as 1885. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, the largest women's organization in the country, also supported suffrage. Anthony's commitment to the movement, her Spartan lifestyle, and the fact that she did not seek personal financial gain made her an effective fundraiser and won her the admiration of many who did not agree with her goals. As the reputation grew, her working and travel conditions improved. Sometimes she used the private railroad car of Jane Stanford, a sympathizer whose husband owned a major railroad. While lobbying and preparing for annual suffrage conventions in Washington, she was provided with a free suite of rooms in the Riggs Hotel, which owners supported her work. To ensure continuity, Anthony trained a group of younger activists who are known as her nieces to assume leadership roles within the organization. Two of them, Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Howard Shaw, served as presidents of the NAWSA after Anthony retired from that position. Now, the NWSA Convention of 1871 adopted a strategy urging women to vote and then, after being turned away, filed suits in federal courts to challenge laws that prevented women from voting. The legal basis for this challenge would be recently adopted, the 14th Amendment, part of which reads, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privilege or immunities of citizens of the United States." Following the example set by Anthony and her sisters shortly before Election Day, a total of nearly 50 women in Rochester registered to vote in the presidential election of 1872. On Election Day, Anthony and 14 other women from her ward convinced the election inspectors to allow them to cast ballots, but women in other wards were turned back. Anthony was arrested on November the 18th, 1872, by the U.S. Deputy Marshal and charged with illegally voting. The other women who had voted were also arrested but released pending the outcome of Anthony's trial. Anthony's trial generated a national controversy and became a major step in the transition of broader women's rights into the women's suffrage movement. Now, Anthony spoke through Monroe County, New York, where the trial was to be held, and from where the jurors from her trial would be chosen. Her speech was entitled, "Is it a crime for a U.S. citizen to vote?" She said, we no longer petition legislature or Congress to give us the right to vote. We appeal to women everywhere to exercise their too long neglected citizens' right to vote." The U.S. Attorney arranged for a trial to be moved to the Federal Circuit Court, which would soon sit in neighboring Ontario County with a jury drawn from that county's inhabitants. Anthony responded by speaking throughout that county before the trial began. Now, responsible for the Federal Circuit was in the hands of Justice Ward Hunt, who had recently been appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Hunt had never served as a trial judge. Originally a politician, he began his judicial career by being elected to the New York Court of Appeals. Now, the trial, United States versus Susan B. Anthony, began on June 17, 1873, and was closely followed by the national press. Following a rule of common law at that time which prevented criminal defendants in federal courts from testifying, Hunt refused to allow Anthony to speak until the verdict had been delivered. On the second day of the trial, after both sides had presented their cases, Justice Hunt delivered his lengthy opinion, which he had put in writing. In the most controversial aspect of the trial, Hunt directed the jury to deliver the guilty verdict. On the second day of the trial, Hunt asked Anthony if she had anything to say. She responded with the most famous speech in the history of the agitation for women's suffrage, according to Andy Gordon, a historian of the women's movement. Repeatedly ignoring the judge's order to stop talking and sit down, she protested what she called a high-handed outrage upon my citizens' rights, saying, "You have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government, my natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights, my judicial rights, and all alike ignored." She castigated Justice Hunt for denying her a trial by jury, but said that even if he had allowed the jury to discuss the case, she would have been denied a trial by jury by her peers because women were not allowed to be jurors.
Ooh.
Ouch. Now, when the Justice Hunt sentenced Anthony to pay a fine of $100, she responded, "I shall never pay $1 of your unjust penalty," and she never did. If Hunt had ordered her to be jailed until she paid the fine, Anthony could have taken her case to the Supreme Court. Hunt instead announced he would not order her taken into custody, closing off that legal avenue. In 1875, the United States Supreme Court put an end to the strategy of trying to achieve women's suffrage through the court system when it ruled in Minor v. Happerstead that the Constitution of the United States does not confer the right of suffrage upon anyone. The NWSA decided to pursue the far more difficult strategy of campaigning for a constitutional amendment to achieve voting rights for women. Now, interestingly enough, in August 18th, 2020, the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, President Donald Trump announced that the pardon of Anthony, 148 years after her conviction. The president of the National Susan B. Anthony Museum and House wrote to decline the offer of a pardon on the principle that to accept the pardon would wrongly validate the trial proceedings in the same manner that paying the $100 fine would have. Now, Anthony and Stanton initiated a project of writing a history of women's suffrage movement in 1876. Anthony had for years saved letters, newspaper clippings, and other materials of historical value for the women's movement. In 1876, she moved into the Stanton household in New Jersey, along with several trunks and boxes of these materials, and began working with Stanton on the history of women's suffrage. Anthony hated this type of work. In her letters, she said the work made me feel all growly all the time. No warehouse ever panted for the rush of battle more than I have outside work. I love to make history, but I hate to write it. The work absorbed much of my time for several years, although she continued to work on other women's suffrage activities. She acted as her own publisher, which presented several problems, including finding space for the inventory. She was forced to limit the number of books that she was storing in her attic at her sister's house because she thought the weight would threaten to collapse the structure. Sounds like somebody else that likes books. Originally envisioned as a modest publication that could be produced quickly, the history evolved into a 6-volume work with more than 5,700 pages, written over a period of 41 years.
Wow.
The first 3 volumes, which cover the movement up to 1885, were published between 1881 and 1886 and were produced by Stanton, Anthony, and Matilda Joslyn Gage. Anthony handled the production details and the extensive correspondence with contributors. Anthony published Volume 4, which covers the period from 1883 to 1900, and in 1902, after Stanton's death, with the help of Ida Husted Harper, Anthony's designated biographer. The last 2 volumes, which bring up the history to 1920, were completed in 1922 by Harper after Anthony's death. Now, the history of women's suffrage preserves an enormous amount of material that might have been lost forever. Writing by leaders of one wing of the divided women's movement, Lucy Stone, the main rival, refused to do anything about the project. It does not, however, give a balanced view of the events where the rivals were concerned. It overstates the role of Anthony and Stanton, and it understates or ignores the roles that Stanton and the other activists who did not fit in with the historical narrative that Anthony and Stanton developed. Because it was for years the main source of documentation about the suffrage movement, historians have had to uncover more sources to provide a more balanced view. Isn't it how they usually say it? To the victors goes the spoils, or in this case, right, to the winners get to write the stories? Now, Anthony traveled to Europe in 1883 for a 9-month stay, linking up with Stanton, who had arrived a few months earlier. Together they met with leaders of the European women's movements and began the process of creating an international women's organization. The National Women's Suffrage Association agreed to host a founding congress. Their preparatory work was handled primarily by Anthony and 2 of her younger colleagues, Rachel Foster Avery and May Wright Sewall. Designates from 53 women's organizations in 9 countries met in Washington in 1888 to form the new association, which was called the International Council of Women. This delegation represented a wide variety of organizations, including suffrage associations, professional groups, literary clubs, temperance unions, labor leagues, and missionary societies. The American Women's Suffrage Association, which had for years been a rival, participated in the Congress. Anthony opened the first session of the ICW and presided over most events. The ICW commanded respect at the highest levels. President Cleveland and his wife sponsored a reception at the White House for delegates. And the ICW's second Congress was an integral part of the World's Columbian Exposition held in Chicago in 1893. At its third Congress in London in 1899, a reception for the ICW was held at Windsor Castle at the invitation of Queen Victoria. In its fourth Congress in Berlin in 1904, Augusta Victoria, the German Empress, received the ICW leaders at her palace. Anthony played a prominent role in all 4 occasions. Still active, the ICW is associated with the United Nations. Now, the World's Columbian Exposition, also known as the Chicago World's Fair, was held in 1893. It hosted several world congresses, each dealing a specialized topic, such as religion, medicine, and science. Almost at the last moment, the U.S. Congress decided that the exposition should also recognize the role of women. After it was over, one of the organizers of the exposition's Congress of Women revealed that Anthony had played a pivotal but hidden role in the last-minute decision. Fearing that a public campaign would rouse opposition, Anthony had worked quietly to organize support for this project among women for the political elite. Anthony increased the pressure by covertly initiating a petition that was signed by wives and daughters of the Supreme Court judges, senators, cabinet members, and other dignitaries. A large structure called the Women's Building, designed by Sophia Hayden Bennett, was constructed to provide meeting and exhibition spaces for women at the exposition. 2 of Anthony's closest associates were appointed to organize the Women's Congress. They arranged for the International Council of Women to be made up of upcoming meeting part of the exposition by expanding its scope and calling itself the World's Congress of Representative Women. This week-long Congress seated delegates from 27 countries and 81 sessions, many held simultaneously, were attended by over 150,000 people, and women's suffrage was discussed at almost every session. Anthony spoke to large crowds at the exposition. Buffalo Bill Cody invited her as a guest to his Wild West show located just outside of the exposition. When the show opened, he rode his horse directly to her and greeted her with dramatic flair. According to a co-worker, Anthony, for a moment as enthusiastic as a girl, waved her handkerchief at him, while the big audience, catching the spirit of the scene, wildly applauded. Now, after Anthony retired as president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, Carrie Chapman Catt, her chosen successor, began to working towards the International Women's Suffrage Association, one of Anthony's longtime goals. The existing International Council of Women could not be expected to support a campaign for women's suffrage because it was a broad alliance and whose more conservative members would object. In 1902, Catt organized a preparatory meeting in Washington with Anthony as chair and was attended by delegates from several countries. Organized primarily by Catt, the International Women's Suffrage Alliance was created in Berlin in 1904. The founding meeting was chaired by Anthony, who was declared to be the new organization honorary president and first member. According to Anthony's authorized biographer, no event ever gave Miss Anthony such profound satisfaction as this one. Now, later renamed the International Alliance of Women, the organization is still active and affiliated with the United Nations.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah. Now, having lived her life in hotels with sisters and relatives, Anthony agreed to settle into her sister's home in Rochester in 1891. At the age of 71, her energy and stamina, which sometimes exhausted her co-workers, continued for a remarkable level. In age 75, she toured Yosemite National Park on the back of a mule.
Fun.
She remained the leader of the NAWSA, continuing her travel extensively for suffrage work and engaging in social projects. By 1896, she spent 8 months on the California suffrage campaign, speaking as many as 3 times per day at more than 30 localities. And in 1900, she presided over her last convention for the NAWSA. And during the last 6 years of her life, Anthony spoke at 6 more conventions, 4 more congressional hearings, completing her 4th volume of the history of women's suffrage, and traveled to 18 states and to Europe. Now, Susan Anthony would die at the age of 86. She suffered from heart failure and pneumonia at her home in Rochester, and she was laid to rest at the Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester. At her birthday celebration in D.C. a few days later, Anthony had spoken of those who had worked for her in women's rights a few days earlier before she died. She said, "There have been others who just as true and devoted to their cause. I wish I could name every one, but with such women consecrating their lives, failure is impossible. Failure is impossible quickly became a watchword for the women's movement." Anthony did not live to see her achievement in women's suffrage at the national level, but she still expressed pride at the progress the women's movement had made. At the time of her death, women had achieved suffrage in Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho, and several larger states followed soon after. Legal rights for married women, and established in most states and most professions, had a few leading women members. 36,000 women were attending colleges and universities, up from zero a few decades earlier. And 2 years before she died, Anthony said, "The world has never witnessed a greater revolution than in the sphere of women in this 50 years." But here was a lady who, basically, you could say she changed the world.
She did definitely had an impact.
But this has been the Bearded Historian. I hope you folks have enjoyed this month of women's history, and we will catch you guys later.
Good night.